I think slowly but surely the Trump administration has come round to the view that the problem is not Ukraine's unwillingness to face the harsh realities of the war, but Putin's.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Gabriella, and I'll be filling in for our regular host today. It's May 21st, 2025.
Right now, we doesn't take a solution. Right now, a lot of conversation about possible solution. And one of the scenario, what you say is to give up territory. It's not fair, but for the peace, temporary peace, maybe it can be solution. Temporary.
The 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine marked a new era in NATO's strategic posture and defense planning. Despite past invasions of Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014, the West underestimated the full scope of Russia's intentions to restore its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. However, while Russia's military goals sought to claim ambitious territorial gains in Ukraine, they were stopped short by the limits of a doctrine still deeply rooted in the Soviet era. In recent months, changes in the postures of key NATO allies have provoked fears that the alliance may not hold if Russian aggression towards Europe continues on past Ukraine. Despite European persistence, as the continent increasingly stands alone in its support for Ukrainian allies, potential to achieve even a short-term ceasefire has dimmed. Regardless of the length as to which the war itself continues on, implications of any settlement will be staggering, both for the state of modern warfare and potential future conflict hotspots like the Indo-Pacific. Ultimately, for Western strategists, the Ukraine war is a cautionary tale about overconfidence and quick victories, the need for resilience in protracted wars, and the importance of anticipating how adversaries adapt across evolving domains. Today, we meet with Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Sir Freedman, hello. Thanks for joining me today. To begin, how did the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine reawaken strategic thinking in the West? Did it force any reassessment of assumptions about the norms surrounding deterrence and escalation?
I think the shift had begun in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, and then the evident belligerence of Putin in the succeeding years. But I think the full-scale invasion made a big difference because it was such a shock that so many forces were being used in this way. And it turned minds back to a very different era. There hasn't been anything else like this in Europe since 1945. So all of those things forced people to rethink. I think it took a while before the full implications sunk in and the question of what this actually meant for European security. But over time, as we've seen, it's led to some galvanization of activity, greater expenditure on weapons, and strategic thinking, not in the way that's often considered in terms of ground strategy or military strategy, but in trying to work out what actually needs to be done to keep Ukraine in the game and to hold Russia at bay. So it's been from the sort of issue that's left for experts and on the margins of European politics, it took center stage, and I think that's the biggest difference.
Shifting more now to look at the Russian engagement within the conflict, can you assess Russia's initial war aims and strategic misjudgments? And what does this reveal about the current state of Russian military doctrine and decision making?
I think in terms of Russian military doctrine, it reveals it hasn't changed at all from Soviet times. It's just basically using mass and trying to overwhelm opponents with whatever it takes, and even at the cost of high casualties. And I think that's been a real part of the Russian problem, that they haven't adapted their land strategy. They've adapted other elements of their strategy, but not their land strategy. In terms of the objectives, I think that was reasonably clear when Putin said that we would use that his objective was denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, which essentially meant the subjugation of Ukraine, stopping its westward drift either through the EU or NATO, and getting it back into a Russian sphere of influence. And I think the territorial objectives, other than Crimea, were less important initially, but became more important as time went on, especially after September 22, when he announced the annexations of four oblasts in addition to Crimea. And that, I think, is where we are at the moment. His problem is that he hasn't actually got hold of all the four oblasts. He's got quite a bit of Luhansk, uh, but quite a lot of Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia still not in his control. And Ukraine's an independent sovereign state and tends to stay that way and is getting sufficient backing from Europe. So his problem is that he can't easily achieve his political objectives by military means. Now it's not clear that he can achieve them by political means either.
If Russia's military doctrine hasn't changed essentially since the Soviet times, and Russia's drivers have likewise remained the same, should NATO allies have better anticipated Russia's move towards expansionism? What warning signs, from the collapse of the Soviet Union to now, merited more attention from the alliance?
It's a good question. I mean, I think Georgia in 2008 was a pretty obvious um, indication, but there were reasons what for Georgia that were not wholly the responsibility of the Soviets. So were the warning signs? Yes. I think Putin's mood changed pretty clearly after the sort of color revolutions of 2004 in Georgia and in Ukraine. He became more and more worried about um, the West moving into the former Soviet space, in addition to what had already happened with the Baltic countries. Um, and then, of course, you had Georgia in 2008, which was a pretty good indication that he was prepared to use force if necessary. Then you had Syria um, in 2015. But again, this all seemed sort of quite limited and manageable. So it showed he was prepared to use force, but not quite how aggressive he was ready to be. Crimea should have been a warning of that. But again, having annexed Crimea and dabbled in eastern Ukraine, he then sort of accepted the Minsk agreements. So it was left a sort of a messy to doubt, unfortunately messy outcome to that fighting, but they really respond as forcefully as might have been the case, especially with Crimea. And I think that gave him confidence that so long as he could manage a limited operation again, which I think he believed Ukraine would be, then the response from the West would be pretty marginal.
Considering these past examples, in terms of NATO's initial and current response to the invasion, have the strategic postures of Eastern and Western European allies evolved differently in response?
Well, I think the basic response has been yes, we've got to build up our own defenses again. Um, I think after the first Trump administration, whatever happened in Ukraine, it was clear that the Europeans were going to have to do more. Um, and I think what has been interesting is, despite expectations and despite all the energy price rises of 2022 and so on, and the assumption that there was going to be Ukraine fatigue, they sort of held together and kept going. So, um, by and large, the positions taken in 2022 have held and become stronger. And even when Trump initially seemed to want to go in a different direction and do a pretty disadvantageous deal with Putin, I think he's backed away from that now. But when he did seem to be prepared to do that, the Europeans again held their positions, and I think made it clear that on a number of issues, from uh, unraveling sanctions to making sure that Ukraine uh, did get more ammunition and support in the future. For all these reasons, it became apparent that they accepted that this is going to be a long haul and they're stuck with it. So I don't think there's been any sort of dramatic shifts other than the initial one and building on that.
Looking further towards the current context, Can you assess the recent and ongoing developments towards a ceasefire in Ukraine, particularly considering the position of the new US presidential administration?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it was very apparent that those who looked at what the Trump people were saying and what Putin was saying, there was an enormous divergence between the two. And I think Trump had got it into his head that Putin, like him, really just wanted a ceasefire, and that the problem was that Ukraine didn't. And therefore, it's got confusing to some extent, but I think it's now much clearer that actually Ukraine could probably do with a ceasefire because it's a bit tired, and could do with some relief, as I believe Russia could as well. And that Putin doesn't want a ceasefire because that would mean his political objectives just hadn't been achieved. And I think that is the most important thing to him, that Ukraine remains sovereign, independent country. So I think slowly but surely the Trump administration has come round to the view, and I think Zelensky's played this quite well eventually too, that the problem is not Ukraine's recalcitrance and willingness to face the harsh realities of the war, but Putin's. And I think with Putin, this has created quite a problem in that whether or not he realizes this, he's not close to winning this war. It can go on for a long time without massive changes in the front lines in his favor, that Ukraine is developing long range capabilities, that his own economy, Russia's economy, is in quite some trouble because of it's got overheated with the defense industry. Now there's an issue with the oil price and so on. So I think, and he's got a president that's going to be as sympathetic to him as any US president is ever going to be. So if he doesn't take this option, what's he going to do? And I think that's the difficulty he's wrestling with at the moment, which is why he keeps on coming up with sort of performative gestures to show that yes, he really is interested in peace without offering any real concessions on his underlying position. And I think that's where we are at the moment. We'll see what happens in coming talks, but the Russians have yet to indicate that they're prepared to shift from their established positions.
Based upon these shifting dynamics between Trump and Putin, despite, as we've discussed, the realizations of the Trump administration that Putin may be the impediment to a potential peace settlement, would you say Putin is still trying to maximize advantages from any settlement for Russian interests? Is he positioning the post Ukraine world order to take shape as more of a Yalta type system of spheres of influence? And how might mid sized regional powers position themselves as a result?
I think he has that sort of idea in his head, of a Yalta type agreement. Um, but it doesn't really work for him because if he was just dealing with the US, that would be one thing. But his problem is that the European powers don't particularly follow the US lead on this at the moment. They have no desire to be part of a Russian sphere of influence and can exercise a positive pull and influence on Ukraine into the future. So I think the problem for Putin is that he hasn't actually got a long-term vision that works. I mean, a sphere of influence approach, which I think the Trump people are quite attracted to, may make sense with China, but it's not. It doesn't really work for Putin in Russia. Indeed, Putin's problem is that the war has made him very dependent upon China, very much a junior partner, and I think that's quite uncomfortable for Russia. And he's just closed off his European options. So I don't think this is a particularly satisfactory situation for the Russians to find themselves in.
Continuing this through line, if there is a return to an international system based on spheres of influence or anything similar, as we've discussed, Russian influence on China may lead to imbalances between these larger powers. How will small states in contested regions adopt more strategically ambiguous foreign policies? And what might this mean for the international order?
It's a good question and a difficult one to answer. In some ways, it it gives them less room for maneuver. Um, I mean, I think what you're seeing at the moment in the Indo-Pacific is a number of states who would prefer to stick with the United States, not sure about the reliability of the United States, or indeed its ability to take account of their interests with the tariffs policy and so on. And they're hedging. So there's a lot of hedging going on at the moment. Interestingly, the Middle East, where Donald Trump has been, um, I think we're seeing a different sort of thing, whereas Trump is happy to extend power to the Gulf states, not particularly to Israel, but to the Gulf states, and allow them uh, quite a lot of influence over his foreign policy, for example, on Syria, maybe Iran, um, on possibly even on Israel. Um, so I think the thing about Trump is he's got very little interest in these big geopolitical issues and getting caught up in future wars on behalf of countries he doesn't necessarily like that much, and is much more interested in economic relations, which of course are problematic because of tariffs. But that's where his interests lie. So I think that it's a time of big uncertainty for countries to quite be sure how they position themselves. There's obviously not help by the fact that Trump shifts a lot. It's not as if he's constant and steady when he's decided on an approach. He varies enormously if he gets pushed back or some other opportunity arises. So I don't think it's a very straightforward thing for anybody, even quite big countries as in Europe, trying to work out exactly how they cope. All they can do is try and establish what relations they can with the administration, and use what contacts they have to shift it in more favorable positions. The basic instinct of this administration is it wants to see international policy, international issues sorted. It doesn't want long-term commitments. It doesn't want forever wars. And I think that means that it's less putting its own imprint on the international system, and events will take their course according to local factors more than because of what the US happens to be doing.
If we can return now to our brief prior discussion on Russia Chinese relations, can you expand on what role deepening alliances with China, Iran, and North Korea play in Russia's future military buildup and posture?
I think they're all different. North Korea's probably materially been as important as any. They kept them in in ordinance last year, provided troops in Kursk and so on. So North Korea has basically committed itself to Russian objectives. China hasn't. China has not endorsed um, Putin's war aims. He doesn't want Putin to lose, and he's backed um, Russia. China's backed Russia economically in important ways. Without that, Russia would be in a lot more trouble now. But I think um, it doesn't feel that it depends on Russia, um, and it's quite an uneven relationship. Iran is interesting because it's provided, which I had drones and providing missiles to Russia, so it's quite important. But of course, it's also quite a fragile regime. And I think if there's one area where you could see change, especially if the Americans do manage, which is still uncertain, to do some sort of deal on Iran's nuclear program, um, then it wouldn't surprise me if Iran was one of the countries that turned out to be less reliable as a supporter of um, of Russia. But we're not there yet at the moment. It's doing what Russia wants.
Looking at these relationships and projecting towards potential for future conflicts, how might the evolved US posture towards Ukraine set a precedent for any future conflict in Taiwan?
I mean, I think you would hope that Russia's experience would remind China that these things never quite go according to plan, and that there are always pitfalls, especially when you're trying to occupy a place where you're not really welcome. And I suspect that is influencing. Chinese thinking, but I also think China's got options that are different from Russia's in terms of how they will put pressure on Taiwan through blockade or whatever, without having to sort of go to a full-scale amphibious operation. I think Taiwan is feeling nervous because although there's quite a lot of sort of anti-China hawks in the Trump administration, you don't get the impression that Trump is that bothered about what happens to Taiwan and would sort of understand it if Beijing gobbled it up. So I think it's a tense and an easy time for the Taiwanese, and that shows. Uh, so, and then of course you've got all the other sort of questions that everybody's asking about. What is the experience in Ukraine? Tell us about drone warfare, now maritime drone warfare, which may be even more important in the Indo-Pacific. So I think there's lots of things to study. To me, the basic message is that taking somewhere with armed force where you're not welcome is always going to be hazardous, even if you succeed in the short term.
Now, ultimately, what lessons should Western military strategists take from the Taiwan War? Is, excuse me, can I start that from
Please
the
do.
top? Sorry, I read back to the ninth question. I apologize. Now, ultimately, what lessons should Western military strategists take from the Ukraine war about the future of modern warfare? If you can expand on any of your points, particularly regarding drone warfare in a potential Taiwan conflict or anything else that they should keep in mind.
I think the basic lesson say is that the use of armed force is full of pitfalls, and you should always keep that in mind. Things never go strictly according to plan, especially if you're occupying somebody else's country. Secondly, if you don't succeed very quickly and you have a successful surprise attack, then you're stuck with a long war. And during the course of the long war, there's going to be a lot more innovation. Um, uh, New tactics develop, new technologies will emerge, and this is what has happened um, with Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is a very different um, animal than it was in February 22 in terms of its military capabilities, its defense industry, and so on. One of the things I think we have learned is that despite the preoccupation with smart precision weapons that we've seen in the West, which are very capable, and the Russians have had them too, you need mass. There's just quantity in some cases is really important. You've got to keep the artillery shells coming. So the big innovation has been large numbers of expendable drones used for a variety of purposes, from attacking targets to reconnaissance and communications and so on. The Ukrainians have done remarkable stuff. The Russians have followed not far behind, but the Ukrainians have been leaders there. Now, part of that reflects problems with air power, which are still a bit unclear as to why the Russians haven't been able to take more advantage of their air strength, but they haven't taken as much. Also, you have to be aware that things that we don't see that much of, that we see lots about drones because drones take images, and when we can see them at work and what they're doing, and that probably accentuates their importance. So that stuff that you don't see so much of, like artillery fire or glide bombs, which were a very effective weapon for the Russians last year, which is as dumb a weapon as you can find. Very crude, but with a big bang at the end, but pretty effective. Um, you can get a misleading picture. So you have geography, the balance of power at the start of the conflict, um, attitudes of population, the size of the armies, all of these will make a difference to what a war looks like. As the final point to make is it's always useful to think of wars in terms of layers uh, of technology. So you look at some of the imagery coming out of Ukraine and it's First World War trench warfare. You see infantry attacks, then you see things like Second World War armored warfare, less of it now. Then you get the drones, now artificial intelligence comes in. And it's not that one replaces the other, but they all interact in a mix of some sort, and that's again one of the things that's happened and complicated the operational environment over the last couple of years. So I think it. I think it's unwise to draw straightforward lessons that if we only apply these weapons in these ways, we'll be victorious, because it never quite works like that. But it is a reminder that when dealing with big armies and big wars, you need the numbers. And if you don't have the numbers, however good your stuff is, eventually you'll be overwhelmed. And I think that's having a big influence on European armies at the moment because they just haven't been big enough.
We've reached the end of our questions for today, but before we depart, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think what's going on at the moment doesn't happen that often in this way. We've had plenty of wars, unfortunately, since 1945, lots of guerrilla warfare, um, lots of very messy civil wars that go back and forth with militias. This is some of the most sustained conventional warfare we've had for a prolonged period. Um, and I think it is just a reminder of how difficult it is to win these sorts of wars and how brutal the fighting can be. That's just as a final point. We haven't mentioned the nuclear issue, which I think I think people exaggerated the ease with which Russia could possibly go to nuclear use. But the prospect of nuclear escalation has contained the conflict. It's meant that NATO countries haven't got directly involved supporting Ukraine, while Russia has not directly attacked Ukraine's NATO supporters. So it's helped nuclear weapons help contain the conflict, and they do provide a sort of an unavoidable source of anxiety, which can produce caution. But I think again, as this war shows, uh, when faced with a choice, countries will still have to press on, and they'll take more and more risks of escalation as they do so. That's the final point. If you do want to escalate, you don't have to go nuclear. Um, Again, one of the things we haven't talked about is the Russian campaign against Ukraine's critical infrastructure, which came close to shutting Ukraine down in 22-23. And we're pretty close over the last winter as well. Excuse me. And now Ukraine has capabilities for long-range strike and so on. So without having to think about using nuclear weapons, there are ways of hurting countries um, that use conventional forces. But in the end, if you can't actually take territory using these weapons, they can be coercive, but they're not necessarily decisive.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today. I know
Pleasure.
our listeners will come away from this with a greater, deeper understanding of the Ukraine war as both continuity and evolution of the development of modern warfare. We greatly appreciate your time and we look forward to hosting you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defence and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Gabriella. Until next time.